Welcome to CNBC Africa's special coverage of the 27th session of the African Union right here in Kigali, Rwanda.
Right, Bonnie, we were anticipating a lot of deliberations today and what came out of them. We've had matters on the African Union passport, which you were anticipating. Traveling has been a crucial issue of concern across the continent. Apart from that, we had, of course, other issues of magnitude, such as security on the region and what has been conversations around the ICC as well.
Right, and in this hour, we intend to give you a blow-by-blow account of exactly what happened here today. We had a good representation of different heads of state. So, George, we had interesting stuff. So we had the good, the bad, and the ugly of the AU, and we'll be walking you through that. But also we have exclusive conversations with President Adesina of the FDB, as well as President Omar al-Bashir of Sudan. All that is coming up in this hour, George. But let's start off, George. What stood out for you?
All right, we're talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly. We'll start off with the good. Women's rights has been highlighted. Of course, it was the theme for the second year running. Before we move on to another theme next year, two candidates have been running to replace the eminent female leader.
Two women candidates.
To
replace a former female candidate.
Right. They've pushed for it. The agenda has been, if we want to see the same issues on women's rights go for another year, we might as well have a representation there. So we had Specioza Kazibwe from Uganda, who happens also to be the first female vice president in Africa. Right. And we had the Botswana representative, Dr. Pelonomi Venson Mutoyo, and she's had tremendous issues to touch on the following year if she is to get the chair.
And we do expect this announcement to come out tomorrow's. It will be announced tomorrow. Obviously, it will shape a lot. But George, there's also been conversation from members of the ECOWAS saying they wanted the vote moved to a later date. We haven't had a lot about that, but we do expect. My bet is that we'll have another female leader.
Everything on course for that, the same. But we also had issues on the framework for Agenda 2063 on that end. Things are finally looking up with the budget.
Things are looking good. I mean, Agenda 2063 has been the flagship of all that puts together the whole African Union, the conversation of having a better, united, integrated Africa. But just I must point, what stood out for me is finally we had a conversation about how exactly to fund this particular Agenda 2063.
Right, and to guide us through that exact funding, we had a presser that was done by the Rwanda's Minister for Finance and Economic Planning, Claver Gatete, breaking down how exactly this will be done budget by budget, sector by sector, to ensure that we don't have any loopholes in financing for the year ahead.
The sources of financing are quite many. Number one, we need to boost our own domestic resource mobilization within the taxation so that we can tax more efficiently to increase our resources. This is what most sustainable. Then number two, we also need to make sure that we have accountability mechanism that avoids this money from leaving our own continent, meaning that everybody pays taxes that you are supposed to pay as per the law. This one is also being done. But also we are trying to make sure that we put in place a conducive environment so that investors can come and invest in our own continent. We are also putting in place a mechanism whereby we develop the capital markets so that the private sector money can also participate in development of our continent through the capital market and the products that we put on the market. Each country in Africa is doing everything they can to make sure that the donor dependence is reduced until it is eliminated. The same thing with the African Union. They have been financing 76%, and that's not good. And that's why the heads of state has taken decisions on how we can finance ourselves. That's what the heads of states are changing. And that's why there was this formula that is binding to all African member countries that is going to remove what has been really happening, where we are depending on the donor for financing of our activities. And that's why we are changing it now. The heads of states have taken a decision that this one must change. Not all the countries are the same level in terms of the GDP. They have a formula, the African Union Commission, which they do, and that's why they call it assessed contribution. That will remain because there has to be fairness so that there is also equitable contribution. That one will remain. What will change is the source of money. Initially, it was coming from our budgets. Now, we have introduced a formula of 0.2% of eligible imports, and that's where the money will come from of financing the activities. but also the financing or the money that will be disbursed will also be in accordance to assessed contribution. So that way then the fairness, the equitable distribution is actually also captured in that process. But also what we are doing is that concerning the NEPAD, they are the normal programs of each of the countries and regions. It is not the African Union Commission that is going to finance the projects, for example, that are in East African community. The projects that we share with Tanzania, with Burundi, with Uganda, with Kenya, with, they are not, there is no way the African Union Commission is coming to finance those projects, even if they are NEPAD related. What that means is that actually the region itself will be financing these kind of programs. But there will be other programs that are continental in nature. And those are the projects that they'll be involved in. But the ones that are regional, that's why you have the regional economic communities, also with resources to make sure that they can finance the regional projects. So this is very clear on which projects they have been financing at the continental level, but also the regions have to chip in, whether it is ECOWAS, whether it is ECAS in Central Africa, Economic Community for Central African States, whether it is SADC, whether it is COMESA, and the East African Community, and so forth. That's why I want to relieve the donors of the burden so that we can finance ourselves. And that means that actually the relationship between the African Union Commission and other countries would actually also continue to depend on other, on the interests of both parties, on trade, on investment, on diplomacy, on other areas where we can support each other. But this time, we should not be a burden to the donor communities. We should be able to finance our own activities. And this is really a very good beginning. Now, before this one is implemented, which is 2017, that was a decision, that this decision be implemented in 2017. What has been happening, the formula, the disbursement way that has been used in the past will continue until 2017.
So that was Claver Gatete, Rwanda's Minister for Finance and Economic Planning. Now, key highlights, of course, as of the breakdown, we really have to acknowledge that it was Donald Kaberuka's idea that had been highlighted, breaking down of the budget and the equation. Right. Key figures that stood out, 0.2% of every eligible import in every individual country will go into an account in the central bank.
So this is over and above the GDP contribution that they
over
do.
and above. We have 1.2 billion now being looked at starting 2017. Of course, if all factors remain constant. Now, we'll be touching on the bad a little later in the show, but that number is...
We have to talk about the bad.
A lot of progress has been made on that end. Before
we
even touch on the negative.
We're still on the good, George. On the contribution, this was very interesting because we have 4 major regions across the African space, SADC, COMESA, EAC, and ECOWAS, and they're going to be having a certain quota that they contribute to the kitty of the union. $65 million every year is coming out of each quarter. This makes $320 million, George, and this is going straight for peacekeeping. Here's the thing, 100% of the AU Commission activities will be funded by the AU. Budget. So the Chinese can keep their money just for now. 75% of the programs will be funded as well, but 25% of the entire budget, which you're talking about $1.2 billion, will be going for peacekeeping missions in Africa. Right,
we'll talk about how much we'll be funding on ourselves. That's still a number that he noted that is still a point of concern. We're still not releasing a lot of money on our end to fund. 76% by donor funding is still a terrible number. Still terrible. Right, so we had the issue of the African Union passport.
Exactly, another good point. Finally, we can move around, but not just tomorrow. When I'm flying back to Nairobi, I can use that. Yeah, not me at least.
Heads of state.
But so we saw President Kagame got the passport. Chadian President Idris Deby also got that passport. It was a very beautiful presentation coming out of the chair of the AU, and obviously offers a lot of promise for Africa.
All right, let's take a look at that particular clip. According to the AU Deputy Chairman, the plan is to issue the passport to all eligible Africans in the next 3 years. But let's take a look at highlights from that particular announcement and more from Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, the chairperson of the African Union.
We today report on a task given to us to ensure that we move closer to the goal of free movement of the people of Africa within the continent. As you would recall, in January, Your Excellencies decided that we must launch the African passport. We are making this start with heads of state and government, foreign ministers, ambassadors, regs, and organs. But I must say that we have had overwhelming requests, inquiries from other ministers, from officials, from African citizens who want to share in this privilege of holding an African passport. So we would therefore suggest for your consideration as we launch the African passport today that we agree to create conditions in the member states to issue the passport to their citizens within their national policies as and when they are ready. It is therefore my distinct honor to present the African passport to the chairperson of the African Union, His Excellency President Idris Deby, and to our host, His Excellency President Paul Kagame. Our teams during the course of the 2 days shall capture the details of other excellencies, heads of state and government, so that you too can receive your African passport. And I think we have 3 other passports that we will give to heads of state who were able to be captured in the previous days. But foreign ministers and ambassadors will also get their passports. So I would like to humbly say thank you on behalf of myself and the Commission. I thank you, asante sana, shukran, merci beaucoup, muchas obrigado.
Afrika itajengwa na nani? Na nani? Amandla. Amandla. Intsinzi. Intsinzi. Aluta. Aluta. A Victoria. A Victoria.
4 years ago, when the leadership of this commission was elected, we were given the honor and the responsibility to serve the African Union and give our best to Africa. This responsibility has taken us to the headquarters of the African Union in Addis Ababa, where on the 25th of May 2013, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the OAU and AU. On that occasion, we reflected together with Africans from across the continent and the diaspora on the road we have traveled and the mission of our founders. We deliberated on the Africa we have and the Africa we want. 2 years later, after listening to African citizens sharing their aspirations, we adopted Agenda 2063, which is our framework towards a continent that is integrated, peaceful and prosperous, driven by its citizens, and playing a dynamic role in the world. Your Excellencies, the Africa we have today is full of hope, possibility, and optimism. We are indeed hopeful because across the length and breadth of our lands, girls and women see our commitment to empower them as we increase women's participation in the table, in peace talks, in parliaments, governments, judiciaries, and the economy. As we advocate for their access to land, education, health, credit, and recognition of their rights as human rights. The third high-level panel on gender equality that preceded the summit, with over 400, mainly women and a few men from across the continent and the diaspora, repeated their call to strengthen financing for gender and the role of women in peace processes. And of course, I must again congratulate the President of Rwanda, because these women from across the continent honored him as the President and the global champion for women's rights. Indeed, they said that they want to congratulate him because they can see that in Rwanda, they no longer go with the saying that behind every successful man there is a woman, but they can see that in Rwanda, they say men and women side by side. Excellencies, we are also hopeful because as African economies continue to grow despite the headwinds, as Carlos would say, and we are moving forward with the continental free trade, as witnessed by the discussions that we had this morning. And our education ministries, teachers and activists, our universities and college principals and faculties, our industries and private sector agree that the African skills revolution in science, technology, innovation, engineering, and maths must happen, and are working to make it happen. We have started preparations for 2017 as the year of investment in youth to harness the African demographic dividend. Over the past 4 years, we met African young men and women in their gatherings in the annual intergenerational dialogue at the AU summits. Youth are responding to our call that came from the email of the future to form AU clubs, adding their energies, innovation, and daring towards the regeneration of our continent. As we take forward reforms of the AU Commission, we must ensure that Africa's youth have a dedicated place in our institutions, in the same way as women have. Your Excellencies, on the occasion of the January 2014 summit in Addis Ababa, I read an email from the future from the year 2063, and I like to quote from that. Africa did not realize its power, but instead we relied on donors that we euphemistically called our partners. Of course, this shift could not happen without Africa taking charge of its transformation, including the financing of our development.
That was the AU Commission Chair, Dr. Lamini Zuma. This is her last session as chair of this session, and that was a beautiful presentation of the passport. George, you do know, East Africans, we used to travel within the region. We not really need a passport. You got a card, but then we had the East African passport. Now we do have the African passport. I have to wait for 2 more years, but it's fine. I mean, I can wait for that. But Judge, there are more important issues about funding for this union, and you spoke exclusively to the President Adesina.
Right. Dr. Akinwumi Adesina spoke about, now we have parallel bodies like the African Development Bank that run, of course, concurrently with what's been happening with the AU, and they have industrialization budgets. Industrialization has been a key topic. We've been trying to figure out how exactly do we keep up with the these projects being stemmed. Every week we have something new.
Right.
So they're now talking to the tune of $3.5 billion per year.
Right.
Direct financing on that end.
Direct financing.
Directly financing.
So obviously it seems like Africa is looking within Africa
Right.
to get solutions for Africa.
Africa for Africa.
Let's have a
by
look at that
Africans.
case. Right.
Thank you very much for creating time to speak to us.
With our pleasure.
All right, I'll go straight into the numbers. The African Development Bank will invest about $3.5 billion per year through direct financing and leveraging to implement your 6 flagship industrialization programs. Now, aside from what's been happening with the AU Summit, we're keen to know how exactly now we're going to work out strategies, knowing that we, first of all, don't have the capacity, and most of the strategies being discussed are still not understood middle to lower level.
You know, well, first and foremost, I think what's most important for the African Union, and hence why I really enjoy this summit, is the political will that Africa has to move forward relentlessly. And I have a lot of impatience with development. I think development should not always have good things happening way into the future. You know, we have lots of people, lots of very poor people in Africa, and they must have development happen to them much faster. During these meetings, I think we discussed the issue of industrialization, which is a big issue. We had a discussion about it today. You know, there is no region of the world that has actually developed and has significant amount of wealth creation without industrializing. There's a perfect linear correlation between your investment in infrastructure, in energy, and also your capacity to industrialize. And when you industrialize, you create a lot of, you know, well-paying jobs. But if you take a look at Africa, we specialize, as it is, you know, in the development of our export of primary commodities. You take a look of any time between 2009 to 2011, even if you take it from 2011 to 2013, Africa exported what? Roughly about $590 billion worth of exports. But 72% of that was actually raw commodities, right? And so the formula for the wealth of nations, for me, is very clear. The countries or the regions that add value are the ones that actually make money. The ones that don't add value get stuck at the bottom of the value chain. And therefore, Africa must rapidly industrialize. Our share of global manufacturing, value added, is only 1.5% globally. And it's been like that for the last decade. And so to do that, we need the bank, the African Development Bank, just approved its industrialization strategy, which we're very much excited about. And we're going to help countries in so many ways. We're going to help countries first and foremost to have the right kind of industrial policy. We're working with the Economic Commission for Africa and that, and also United Nations Industrial Development Organization. But also looking at how to have right kind of infrastructure. Solving the energy crisis is a problem. But also private-public partnerships are going to be very important. But so also the issue of mobilizing domestic capital. The capital market is awash with a lot of money in Africa. And so we are going to work as African Development Bank to help African countries to mobilize significant amounts of domestic resources that are simply sitting there in the pension funds and in the sovereign wealth funds and the private equity funds to be able to support Africa's industrialization. There are examples of what's working. You take a look at Ethiopia, you know, what they've done, you know, with regard to textile industry and the leather industry. And you look at Rwanda, latecomer, but running so fast. You take a look at Rwanda, what Rwanda is also doing with regard to textile industries. So as part of that industrialization strategy that we're going to finance is to help countries to develop special economic zones, industrial clusters that can borrow technology from China. Look at China. You go to a place called Shenzhen, right? If you look at it, you know, many years ago, in a 10-year period, it went from an area where the per capita income was no more than $400 per person, you know, to one where it's over 20,000 per person. That's the kind of thing that we need in Africa. So the issue is quite practical. It's that the decision has been made politically that Africa has to industrialize. We have natural gas, we have oil, we have, you know, minerals, you know, metals, but we are exporting all of these primary commodities, and so we are always subject to these global volatilities in the commodity prices. No, we need to end that, and Africa must diversify, but Africa must add value to every single thing it produces.
All right, you've created context for the conversation. Let's take a look at some of the loopholes. Maputo Protocol Article 15, the right to food security. Now, relatively, that still remains a myth. We compare it maybe to countries within the West where we're seeing, even in the states where there has been developed research on agriculture and food security, there can be an expectation of at least 34% below average crop production. So food security on the African context, what is your way around this conversation?
Well, you know, I mean, Africa is blessed by God tremendously, I must tell you. 65% of all the arable land left to feed 9 billion people by 2050, it's not in Latin America, it's not in Asia, it's actually right here in Africa. So what Africa does with agriculture is going to determine whether you and I, well, I don't know, I'm not going to be around that long, you know, hopefully, you know, but if 2050, it's a long time now, but Africa is going to determine how we're going to feed the world. So we must raise productivity of agriculture. We must make agriculture not a way of life. We must make agriculture a business. And to make it a business, it means we have to industrialize the agricultural sector. You know, take a look at most of the things that we are eating today. With urbanization, with population growth, and also middle income class that is actually growing, you find there's this demand for a lot of processed food. Right? Most of that processed food is imported. Africa spends today $35 billion a year importing what it should be producing, right? And if you do nothing, by 2025, that's going to rise to $110 billion. So Africa is literally importing what it can produce, is exporting jobs and importing poverty. And at the same time, it is driving up inflation, because if anything happens to global commodity shock prices for anything that you're importing, the transmission effect to our local economies is very, very, you know, direct. And so it's not even in Africa's interest in terms of security to be that dependent. So what we've done at the African Development Bank is that we have a strategy to support African economies to make agriculture a business, to industrialize the agricultural sector. I'll give you a simple example. Take the case of cocoa. African countries produce 75% of the global volume of cocoa produced. But that's not where the money is made. The money is made from chocolates. Well, the size of the chocolate market globally is $100 billion a year. Africa accounts for only 2% of that. So we are producing the raw materials, right? But we are not benefiting from adding value to it. So the strategy that we are going to be doing is supporting African countries, diversify their economies, add value, take the value chains, whether it's rice, whether it's cassava, whether it's sweet potato, whether it is you know, horticulture produce like Kenya is doing tremendously, where you're from Kenya, add value to everything and move Africa to the top of the value chains, right? And so I really believe that for African economies, if we make agriculture a business, we're going to be able to lower inflation. We're going to be able to lower the amount we're spending in importing food, so therefore conserve your foreign exchange. We'll be able to create a lot of jobs in the rural economy, because that's where agriculture really is. And Africa will be able to be more competitive via agro-allied industrialization. So agriculture is what Africa has going for it, but it has to be agriculture as a business.
The president of the African Development Bank, Akina Disina, speaking to us about the industrialization budget and step-by-step implementation of some of the projects that the bank has. But apart from that, right. Mr. Bonitunya.
Right.
The bow ties.
The bow tie.
Right.
He's the man with the bow ties.
The man with the bow ties,
right.
He said he has enough to last him well over 3 years.
Well
they
over
help
3
him
years.
think. He had thoughts on the same particular issue.
Okay, I don't want to, they help, let's just for a moment imagine how he keeps bow ties to last him 3 years.
He probably gets them somewhere, in a
right.
warehouse, somewhere within this,
written the bow tie room.
Written the bow tie room.
So much for
All
imagination.
Right. We've touched on the good, left with the bad and the ugly. We'll tackle that over the next half hour of the show. We'll be back with more right after the break.
Welcome back. You're still watching CNBC Africa's special coverage of the African Union, the 27th Summit, right here in Kigali, Rwanda. Bonitunya and George Durango still with you. Let's talk about the bad, George.
Right.
Lots of good things have happened, but also lots of bad things have happened.
A lot of loopholes
right.
on that particular issue. One of them that has been highlighted, of course, we talked about every region contributing the amount of money, and we broke down the budget according to Donald Kaberuka's right. Breakdown and his suggestions. But every region is supposed to contribute $65 million per year. Right. That's $320 million yearly for peacekeeping.
For peacekeeping.
Right. So that's under the assumption that we'll be fighting all year long.
Right.
Right.
And we don't know how long this peacekeeping would go, or this conflict would be.
So in the event that we do not have any peace resolution to happen, what happens to the $320 million?
Well, Another HQ maybe? But really, more importantly, has been also the fact that a lot of African Union interventions in most of this conflict has to go through the UN. And we had officials out of the AU saying that this probably needs to change because it slows the pace of them going into the region. For example, South Sudan. We haven't had a conclusive statement on when they're going to South Sudan or what they're going to do in South Sudan. So obviously that is also a big loophole and a bad for the AU.
Of course, the issue of South Sudan and Sudan, you tackled it with the His Excellency, the President. We'll have that a little later in the show. But more from the bad, Bonnie?
Yeah, looking at the bad also, we've talked about that funding, that over 70% of the funding coming internationally into the African Union comes from foreigners. Let's read the West. So obviously that messes up your gender setting, the kind of priorities that you do have. Why are we having the African Union in Africa funded 75% by the West?
Exactly. So we talk about Africans for Africa by Africa. That might not be the case. Take a look. You've mentioned the role that at least all players have on the chain, but given all the information that has come out and you on the helm of such a bank, understanding needs on financing and what needs to be addressed, why are we taking so long for players within the African Union to realize that there's an actual problem?
Well, you know, the issue for us as African Development Bank is we are there to support the hopes and the aspirations of the African continent. The African Union actually has done a lot of very good job in mobilizing political will behind agriculture, for example. You know, I mean, in terms of the Maputo declarations that the countries should increase the amount of their share of their GDP going to the agricultural sector. A lot still needs to be done, but a lot more progress is being made now than before. And so I think what we need to do is continue the political momentum. But more than anything else, to realize that whether it is agriculture, whether it's minerals, whether it's oil, whether it's gas, whatever it is, it's not just the government that's going to get things done, it's the private sector. And so we must really encourage a lot of private sector. And if you're going to encourage private sector, we've got to wake up to the fact that Africa doesn't have energy. You know, we're talking about industrial growth today. China needs to externalize a lot of its industries because they're changing their growth model to look more internally within China.
Could I reel into the issue on energy? One particular project that the AFDB has worked on, installing 1,422 megawatts of new electricity capacity, of which only 72 megawatts was renewable. Now, on that context of energy, we are seeing that this is away from the green initiatives that had earlier been pushed by the bank.
Well, you know, let me tell you something about energy. The bank launched what is called the New Deal on Energy for Africa. That New Deal on Energy for Africa is supposed to drive for Africa to become self-sufficient in energy 100% within 10 years. It has different components. A big component is going to be unlocking our huge potential in renewable energy, right? Renewable energy is massive for us, whether it's sun, whether it is geothermal here, whether it is also looking at wind, massive amount. We're going to lead on that. We are doing that already. Lake Turkana is an example in Kenya. You saw the Wazasate plant, which is the largest solar concentrated power station that you have in Morocco. So the bank will continue to do that. But I just want to say that there's no region of the world where their energy is only by renewables. No. In fact, contrary to what you hear, whether it's in the European Union today, their entire energy mix is just about renewable is only 19%, right? If you take a look at the United States, it's 8% in terms of renewable energy. And if you take a look at the same situation for China, maybe 5%, right? Most of these economies depend on coal. Most of them depend on solar, on coal, a little bit of hydro, but most of them also depend on having nuclear power plants. But for Africa, it has to have a balanced energy mix that includes using its renewable, and let's use all of it, use all the sun until it becomes the moon, but realize that industries don't run on solar panels. Industries runs on baseload power. And so Africa needs to use what it has, in particular natural gas, significant amount of natural gas, but also to use clean coal technology. There's nothing ugly about coal. It just has to be clean coal technology. The other thing we are going to really be supporting a lot of is climate resilient agricultural systems, using water better, having drought tolerant crops that can actually withstand a lot of the drought that you have is going to be a big component of how we do that. But also doing quite a lot in terms of clean energy solutions are also going to be a big part of how we are going to increase the amount that we are spending on climate finance. But I must say that when we all met in Paris for the COP21, and the whole world signed on to $100 billion to support developing countries in adapting to the issue of climate change. We're yet to see that money, and African countries need that money, and they need it desperately. So our share of it is that we've committed that we will spend $5 billion a year in terms of climate finance by 2020. But we also need to leverage global climate finance institutions such as the Global Environment Facility and the Green Climate Fund, so that they will spend more money in Africa, in helping Africa to adapt to climate change. Our problem is not how to mitigate. We are not the ones emitting. Right. Our problem is just how to adapt. And I think Africa, in my view, has been already shortchanged by climate change. It shouldn't be shortchanged by climate finance.
Right, and finally, my final question, of course, has to come in regards to the AU passport. There's been a lot of controversy around it. I can see you smiling about it. But it's been received differently, and of course, there's different levels of implementation that are being talked about. On the helm of the African Development Bank, what kind of conversations are happening in regards to this particular issue?
Well, first is that Africa, you have 54 countries. Africa needs to trade a lot more with itself. And if Africa is to trade more with itself, people have to be able to move easily between countries. The African Development Bank, we did an assessment which we call, Africa Visa Index that we produced, and we asked, how easy is this for Africans to move from one country to the other? It's not. Africans only need visas. I mean, they don't need visas in only about 25% of all the countries. Everywhere else, they need visas. I was excited today when I looked and I saw that Ghana has scrapped the need for visas. I see what has happened here between, in East African Economic Community, between Rwanda, between Uganda, Tanzania. You see what's happening with Kenya, that you can literally come almost like a visa, almost like a Schengen visitor's visa. You get in one location and you can move around. Why is this important? It's important for business people to be able to move. It creates a perception of you are open to business. Second is labor mobility. A big share today of Africa's GDP is from the service industry. But if you take a look at it, whether it's engineering, whether it's audit firms, whether it's accountancy firms, it's difficult for companies to register in other places because of all these rigidities that we have. So I think the visa is just one part of our liberalizing our overall market so that we can have a bigger market and we can have easier labor mobility of skills all across Africa. I look forward to the passport, the unique African passport. You and I ought to be able to carry an African passport, and to be able to go anywhere that you want with that particular passport. If we as Africans don't have confidence in ourselves,
who else will?
Who else will?
Let's revisit that issue, George, about the bad still in the region. And a lot of people didn't expect the Sudanese president, Omar al-Bashir, to actually set foot here. Obviously, we had a statement coming out of the Rwandan Foreign Office saying they do welcome him. He is a guest of Rwanda and a guest of the AU. The AU has come out to speak against the arrest warrant. Right. Well, Bashir was here, and we had an exclusive conversation with him.
Allow me to do the honor.
Please.
My colleague Bonnie Tunya spoke to His Excellency Omar Bashir, President of Sudan, on particular issues that have stemmed from the last couple of years and happening right now that should set the precedent for the rest of the year and more deliberations within the African Union. Take a look.
We are at the venue of the 27th AU Summit in Kigali, Rwanda, and CNBC Africa has the pleasure of speaking to His Excellency President Omar al-Bashir, President of Sudan. Mr. President, thank you very much for this opportunity. Obviously, the big question regarding Sudan right now has to be about the U.S. sanctions. How much of an impact has the sanctions been on Sudan's economy?
الحين احنا نرحب بكم وسعيد بهذا اللقاء. حقيقة العقوبات الأحادية الأمريكية.
First of all, we are glad to meet the media here in Rwanda. The American unilateral sanctions on Sudan have negative effects on Sudan because of the influence of America on companies and banks worldwide. So they hindered us from having international finance for our projects and preventing us from having technology to Sudan. For example, we have the biggest railway in Africa, but this sector is demolished because 90% of our railway transportation system is made in USA and Europe. The investors think twice before investing in Sudan.
من أكبر الآثار الآن الواضحة أنه سكك حديد السودان، وهي أكبر شبكة سكك حديد موجودة في أفريقيا، تدمرت هذه الشبكة.
Because the Americans make it hard for them to transfer their profits from Sudan via the American banking system.
والحقيقة المقاطعة دمرت هذا القطاع. المقاطعة حرمت كثير جدا من المستثمرين أنه يأتوا إلى السودان لأنه هناك مشكلة كبيرة جدا.
The unilateral American sanctions affected the health sector as we cannot import medicine made in USA or Europe. The higher education and research sector is affected because we cannot import technology needed for our development. Our economy is suffering from the unjust and unfair American sanctions. Moreover, we are not given the opportunity to lift the international debts within a HIPEX group, although it is one of our rights in Sudan.
أيضا من ضمنها هي حرمان السودان من حقوقه في إعفاء الديون في إطار المجموعة بتاعت الهيبكس.
Mr. President, let's talk about the investment opportunities and the role that Sudan plays in the region, especially in the area of food security, because looking at the conflict in South Sudan and the areas around, food security becomes a big challenge. Give us a sense of what is your role as Sudan as far as mitigating food security?
قطعا السودان واحدة من الدول.
Sudan is definitely looked at as one of the countries which offer food security for the world, along with Australia and Canada. These three countries can make the change in the food security of the world's future.
وعنده مناخات متعددة تمكن من إنتاج كل أنواع الحبوب، الزيوت النباتية.
Sudan has big lands and naturally fertilized soils with diverse climates that give the opportunity for hygienic food as cereals, vegetarian edible oils, red and white meat, sugar, etc. And Sudan has different water sources as rain and the river Nile, underground water, etc. These are all factors which can make food projects succeed easily in Sudan.
العالمي. نحن الآن بننشئ في مشروعات ضخمة جدا. عندنا مشروع الجزيرة لوحده فيه 2 مليون.
Now we have started huge projects. For example, Al Jazeera agricultural project consists of 2 million acres. We have Al Rahad agricultural project with 1 million. Sitita and Adbara project with over 1 million acres. Marwi project is approximately 1 million acres. And all of these big projects we are working on now are irrigated with the river Nile watering system.
الآن الحقيقة بتتوفر لها كميات كبيرة جدا ومبالغ ضخمة من التمويل. الآن في إقبال كبير جدا من الشركات خاصة من المملكة العربية السعودية.
We also have an initiative called the Arabic Food Security, and the big amount of finance will be provided as many investors around the world are intending to invest, especially from Saudi Arabia, the Gulf area and other countries around the world. Our vision, not to just afford the food for Sudan and the region, but to contribute globally towards securing the food for all the world nations in the future. We also have neighboring countries in Africa who are suffering to have cheap food. For example, our neighbors in South Sudan are suffering from war and displacement. Central Africa as well, and other countries that are affected by the dry weather and deserts, countries with high population density as Ethiopia and Egypt are all in need of food security, and we really plan to cover all of our neighbors at least and the rest of Africa. Despite the American sanctions, we will succeed in making the best for Africa.
الآن بنحقق يعني نجاحات كبيرة جدا في استقطاب مستثمرين جادين في مجال الأمن الغذائي.
And Mr. President, South Sudan obviously is a big concern to the region, and especially with the recent news. And people would wonder, is there a role that Sudan can play in resolving this conflict?
طبعا حكاية مؤسفة. نحن عملنا اتفاقية السلام الشامل.
What is happening to our neighbors in South Sudan is so sad. My government, Sudan's government, has signed the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, the CPA, to end the war in our united country and to end the suffering of people and displacement and migration.
احنا ضحينا بوحدة السودان وانقسم السودان لدولتين. الهدف الأساسي.
It was a big step from our side to end the war, but it was a sacrifice of our unity when it led to the separation of the southern Sudan. Unfortunately, when the separation of the south has happened, we lost our unity, but moreover, we lost the most important thing, which is peace and security for our citizens living in the southern part of Sudan.
العادي كان محمي. الآن المواطن العادي في جنوب السودان فقد الحماية، فقد الأمن.
What is happening in South Sudan after separation has never happened during the 20 years of internal war in the United Sudan. War in Sudan, when it was united, was between the government army and the armed rebels. And we were protecting the citizens in the conflict areas. But now, as you obviously see, the normal citizen in South Sudan is losing his security and protection. Now, since these incidents have started in South Sudan, we in the north have accommodated more than 1 million of southerners crossing our borders to our country because of these internal wars. We in Sudan cannot treat them as refugees because these people were part of Sudan until 2011 in one united country, and we really care for them. So we called their leadership in the south, Mr. Salva Kiir Mayardit, and the Vice President, Mr. Riek Machar, asking for fire cease and encouraging them to cool the situation down and control their own forces. But unfortunately, we believe that the leaders have no control over their forces. Either Mr. Salva Kiir or Mr. Machar and the personal guards of each leader have started this bloody fight. But we insist that the peace efforts should continue to bring back the security to our neighboring nation.
مواطن في جنوب السودان.
Finally, Mr. President, let's talk a little bit about the ICC. The allegations the ICC has against you, do they hinder your participation in the region? Because everyone was worried. Will President Bashir come for the AU?
قطعا الآن أفريقيا عندها موقف بعد ما تكشف.
Africa now owns its decision and has its own stand after the African people discovered the political agenda of this court called the ICC. And after all the world have discovered with the documents that this court's judges, counselors and prosecutors were receiving bribes. Many strong evidences were collected. So the Africans are united against this court and the African voice becomes so strong. Now the African governments are working all together to plan the continent's withdrawal for all the African countries. And I'm moving in Africa because this is an African position and independent opinion, despite the attempts of the ICC and the Americans to misguide us. And we are all wondering in shock that the USA is not a member of the ICC. Moreover, America criticizes this court, considering it as an invasion court. Hence, the Americans have a law that allows the American army and forces to fly and free any American who would be captured by this court. We just thank the African nations and leaders for this united and complete rejection of such hypocrisy and such playing with justice in the name of the what's so-called ICC. That's why I can freely fly over our continent. That's why I can freely fly over our continent as an African man from north to south and from east to west.
His Excellency Omar al-Bashir, the President of Sudan, speaking to Boni Tunya. Now, For the years or months that I have known Mr. Boni Tunya, I know him for speaking only 2 languages.
Right.
But he kept nodding through the entire interview.
My
Mr.
Arabic
Boni
is
Tunya.
pretty good.
Your Arabic is not good at all. You know no Arabic. How exactly were you keeping up with
I
what's been
know.
happening?
He said shukran to say thank you.
Right.
And that's all we need.
The interview was well over 15 minutes, Boni?
Yes.
Yeah.
There's something called interpreters.
Right.
Yes, we use that. But I mean, George, what came out of that conversation, like you said, it was iconic. Speaking to this leader who's under so much controversy over the years. But what came out, obviously, the elephant in the room, the ICC arrest warrant on his head.
And
he said, he said he's a free African. Right. The Sudanese people do not see any legitimacy in the ICC court. And he pointed out issues that, like, the court was corrupt and it was seeking a political agenda. And he said he's still going to be flying across Africa because he's a free African and that's what Africans do.
He touched on how our government leaders were going to work out the conversation on Africans.
Exactly. That is another point that is obviously being pushed at the AU. We saw it as a main agenda during President Kenyatta and Deputy Ruto's cases at the ICC. The AU had a very strong position about that, and he was very confident that the African governments are leading their people to walking out of the ICC.
All right, that was President Omar al-Bashir. Let's now move on. We've touched on the good, the bad. Let's touch on the ugly. Right. What is, in most cases, grey areas we don't like to touch on, but it has to be discussed. The fact that the Burundi delegation was recalled, that one was mentioned, but U.S. sanctions, particularly for Sudan. But we've seen that being implemented elsewhere, in Zimbabwe.
In Zimbabwe, terrible situation. So the Zimbabwean finance minister, Chinamasa, was speaking to journalists earlier on, George, and he admitted the fact that the country could not pay its civil servant and military because they simply are at a difficult position financially because of the sanctions issued internationally. So I mean, that is a big thing. Also in the conversation, President Bashir, sanctions came up. This was a big issue that the economy was practically on its knees on account of the sanctions.
So by the time you reach a point where you can't pay your army and you can't pay your civil servants, you know there's actually a real problem, particularly when there's a lot of a very liquid African continent, so to speak, although we don't know where the money could be going to. So we'll touch on those. At least he mentioned those particular issues of concern. Now we've touched on the good, the bad and the ugly. And as we come to the close, of course, before you even give us your take home on what you're a guest here, we had to host you.
In Rwanda, but a guest of the government. Well, and the people of Rwanda.
Debatable, Bonnie. You have to say that because you're on camera. All right, so we have at least the biggest losers, the biggest winners on our end here have been, number one, the aviation industry.
The aviation industry. Over 30 private jets. It's a sight to behold, George. We don't see this many jets in Rwanda, but hey, I mean, it was an amazing feat to just have that sort of organization that would bring all these important people in Kigali, and just the beauty that all these jets had at the Kigali International Airport.
We know that the airport is relatively small compared to other regional airports, so they try to fit in even where the taxiways, they try to fit in all the planes in there. Apart from that, hoteliers.
Hotel industry.
Where we are right now.
We're just sitting in front, at the back. My direction is terrible.
In the front of the Radisson Blue, Bonnie.
Exactly. It just opened a couple of weeks ago.
And it was launched at the same time as the Kigali Convention Center. But apart from that, bookings, it was almost impossible to get a room in Kigali during AU week. If it was not for CNBC, Bonnie, we'd be discussing over Skype.
But I mean, also the fact that Rwanda has put MICE as a very strategic point of their tourism agenda, and it's really good to see it's taking shape. Kigali hosted the World Economic Forum just a couple of months ago. Hosting the African Union right now is really a vote of confidence on the part of the country's tourism sector, and the fact that MICE is indeed a sector of the wider tourism bit that other African countries can take up and learn from.
All right. I spoke to you earlier about the business of hiring and purchasing SUV and large body vehicles to help transport people. Those were some of the biggest winners. Hiring of vehicles and the transportation industry, biggest
traffic
winners.
was terrible. That's a sad point of all this madness, because when you have over 30 heads of state in one city, the logistical nightmare is just ridiculous.
Traffic, you mentioned traffic. Of course, the general public was not particularly aware of what was happening apart from social media and the live streams that were here. So they had the most to say about the particular traffic in Rwanda. But I mean, a small price to pay for a lot expected in Rwanda.
George, what was the biggest takeout out of the African Union conversations for you?
Right. I think my particular issue and take home has been Rwanda being the host. Tremendous. We anticipated a lot of loopholes here and there, but it was handled straight off the bat in terms of security and ensuring all protocols were engaged. I mean, all those heads of state managing that must have been a task. And deliberations, of course, we are still very skeptical about implementation on the African continent. Implementation has not been our strong suit. We do a lot of deliberation, implementation not on the same, but I have to hand it to Rwanda for how they handle all these heads of state, all these egos being rubbed and all these protocols being able to be managed. I mean, a kudos, a big thumbs up to Rwanda for that end.
Right. For me, it's got to be the African passport. I'm passionate about Africans being able to move across the continent. It's going to take 2 years. That's a pretty long time.
2 years on paper.
2 years on paper.
But
at least President Kagame and President Dabi had their passports. I think that's a big thing for Africa, that finally integration is really being put to test, and we're going to see a lot of Africans traveling across the continent, and hopefully we'll see a reduction in the cost of travel across the continent.